This is Mark Patterson. I'm calling the meeting to order, the New York State Cemetery Board to order for this October meeting. Welcome, everybody. We are operating under some new rules, although those new rules are kind of the new normal, but I found it useful to go over them and go over the agenda in advance just so everybody's clear about what will be happening. First of all, the meeting's recorded, just so that everybody knows that. We do ask that everybody identify themselves when they're speaking, each time they're speaking. Please put your phone or your computer on mute if you're not speaking. That really makes things easier. We will have public participation. Identify yourself. If you're on the Webex, you can use the chat function to say you want to speak, but I will also open it up to everybody who might not be using that, so everybody will get a chance to speak. We also request for attendance if you're speaking or if you're a lobbyist. Tony will go over all those rules later. I think we'll go into executive session today. If we do, we'll take a vote to go in, and we'll also take a vote to come back out and reconvene, report any action or take any action, and then adjourn the meeting. So I think we're ready to go. Let me introduce the board. I'm Mark Patterson, representing Secretary of State Rossana Rosado. Jill?
Hi, I'm Jill Faber, representing Attorney General Letitia James.
And Tom?
Yes, this is Thomas Fuller, representing Dr. Howard Zucker for the Department of Health.
Thank you all. So we have all of the board members here. Again, just quick, the flow of the meeting. Tony will go over the new rules for the remote meetings and public notice required meeting, approval of minutes, the legislation and rules and regulations report, the division report, the vandalism report. Then there's the presentation of vandalism applications, and then we'll have a presentation of other applications to the board. There's always votes, discussion and votes on that. We'll also let the public or anyone else wishing to speak to a particular application have an opportunity to speak. We'll go to executive session if needed by making a motion, and again, we'll return and come out of back into public session. We've got another room set aside for that, so folks can either stay in line or, if possible, we'll try to let you know when we're coming back out. Tony, would you help us with explaining the new rules for remote meetings and public postings and all?
Sure. Thanks, Mark. We are operating under the Governor's Executive Order 202.1, which has been extended. Under that executive order, there's a suspension of law allowing attendance of meetings telephonically or other similar service. Article 7 of the Public Officers Law is modified to permit any public body to meet and take such actions authorized by the law without permitting in-person access to meetings, and authorizing such meetings to be held remotely by conference call or similar service, provided that the public has the ability to view or listen to such proceedings and that such meetings are recorded and later transcribed. And in fact, we are recording these meetings. This executive order has been interpreted to suspend the requirements that board members be physically convened or convened by video conferencing, to suspend the requirement that notice of the meeting include the physical location of each board member who's participating by telephone or similar means. We've given the public notice of the meeting and how to attend by video conference or by telephone conference, and the board agenda and board material have been placed on the Division of Cemeteries website. As Mark noted, we are taking attendance. Giving your name and who you represent is voluntary, unless you are a lobbyist, and then you must identify yourself and your client. And anyone who speaks to the board should identify themselves.
Tony, thank you. I don't know if anybody has any questions about those procedures, what the rules we're operating under. Since we've been doing this a while, I'll assume that there are none. Great. So I think the next thing on the agenda is the approval of the minutes. Does anybody have any? Do we have one or two sets of minutes that we're approving today?
I see two.
See two?
August 11th and September 8th.
Okay. So we'll take them one time can I, does anybody have any changes or corrections to the August 11th board meeting?
No.
None here.
There being none, I'll make a motion to approve the minutes as distributed of the August 11th board meeting. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Tom. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
And next, are there any questions, corrections, or suggestions for the September board meeting?
Not from me, no.
Thank you, Jill.
None here.
Tom, I'll make a motion to approve the minutes of the September board meeting. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Jill. All in favor? Aye.
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 That approves the minutes of the August and September board meeting. Thank you. Next on the agenda is the legislation and the rules and regulation support from our council. Tony Mello. Tony, would you like to update us?
Sure, yep. Not a lot has happened. Actually, some of the updates are things that I just missed the last month or two. Scrolling down. Minor changes. Enacting clause, this is number 16 on the list. Assembly Bill 6613, the enacting clause was stricken. Let's see.
That's on my Wi-Fi.
Number 22 on the list.
On my cell.
Senate 5057-A was recommitted, enacting clause stricken. And that might be it. Actually, the very last bill, excuse me, number 36 on the list. This had previously been a one-house bill, Senate 8873. It's now has an assembly companion bill, Assembly 10929, introduced by Assembly Member Hunter and referred to corporations. This occurred on August 17. That's all I have for the legislation report. I do have unless there are questions, I'll go to the status of our proposed regulations.
Go ahead, Carly.
Right. So previously, we had drafted the portion of the regulations. This relates to abandonment that describe steps the division to take to prevent an abandonment. And those have been presented to the board. The board's reviewed them, and the board authorized us to meet with interested parties to get their input. And we have gotten their input on that portion. We've now drafted procedures to an abandoned cemetery taken over by another cemetery, or to have an abandoned cemetery determined to be abandoned and therefore its care taken over by the towns. So those procedures are still being modified. So we don't have them to present to the board right now. We would like, though, to share them with interested parties to get their input, and should have them ready to present to the board next month. There are two sets of procedures. One is a procedure for abandonment to a cemetery. Essentially, the cemetery has to be determined to be a qualified cemetery. Wouldn't want a cemetery that's struggling itself to take over another struggling cemetery. And so there's a procedure for that, and a procedure to make sure it complies with all the other requirements in statute. And then for abandonment to a town, the procedure we've identified is for the division to make a determination that the cemetery has in fact become abandoned, and it sets forth what the division must do to notify parties that it has made that determination. And then it provides that within 60 days of a determination letter, the determination shall be presented to the cemetery board for final determination. Um, There's options with that part of the draft regs. We could make it that it wouldn't go to the board unless someone challenges the determination, either the cemetery, the town, or lot owners, anyone. I have drafted this, and division seems comfortable with an automatic review by the board, so that every determination of abandonment would be presented to the board, whether challenged or not. So that's the procedure. Oh, and one other thing, in preparing this, it occurred to me that an existing regulation, probably it would be timely to modify that. This is section 200.2. It's called Applications for Orders or Determinations, and it sets forth what cemetery board determinations can be heard by the division in the first instance. That regulation is really out of date. In fact, it doesn't permit fee applications to be heard by the division, yet the cemetery board has in fact delegated that to the division. So I am recommending to the board that while we're creating these new regs for abandonment, we also modify the reg section 200.2 applications for orders and determinations to get it current with what practice actually is between the board and the division.
Does anybody have any questions of Tony on his report? Just a point, two points, please. One, I noticed a couple background sounds. Reminder again, if you're not speaking, please mute yourself. The other one is that these informal feedback sessions we're getting don't get in the way or substitute for the formal regulatory process. That when the rules or regulations are formally proposed, there also will be a period of time for comment. So, but does anybody have any questions about Tony's report so far?
None here.
And I'm assuming that means that you're in agreement that we continue to move forward with these drafting of regulations, getting informal feedback, and I hear Tony's suggestion about amending another regulation while we're at it. That seems sensible to me. Okay, so next on our agenda is the division report. Louis, you want to give a division report?
Yeah, I haven't got all that much, and I'm going to defer to Alicia on the delegated duties report, the statistics on that. But on our end, obviously, we continue to be in touch with the rest of the Mortuary Affairs Task Force and other partners, and we are obviously concerned about staying ahead of a possible second wave, whether or not we are seeing that right now. The other thing, which I don't know, I can't recall whether I addressed this at the September meeting, so I'm going to say it again. Anyway, at a previous meeting, I had indicated that our unscientific survey of selected downstate cemeteries showed burial numbers below average for 2019, and we got information from the CDC via the Department of Health, which indicates that whatever the cause may be, it's not that we are actually seeing whatever a negative number in excess deaths. In other words, it's not the case that fewer people have been dying in June, July, or in August than was the case. It is the normal trend. So whether it just happens to be a statistical blip for those particular, I think I did report on this last month, but it can't hurt to mention it again because I've been talking about this for a while. Whether it's just a statistical blip that those cemeteries saw a little bit of a downtick after seeing a huge uptick, or whether it's something that's going on across cemeteries in the area, I couldn't tell you, but I can tell you that it's not because of lower death numbers. In happier news, the crematory operator certification course ran last weekend. We had lots of people have needed to get recertified, and hopefully they are now recertified, or we'll be getting the certificates out for people who passed. And we are starting to do more continuing education sessions for funeral directors as they begin their new cycle for having to complete those requirements. And we've updated those to include current information about any modifications for practices based on the emergency and executive orders and guidance from the division. That's all I've got.
Does anybody have any questions for Louis?
No.
Okay, thank you. And Alicia, you're going to report on the division's activities or delegated duties?
Yes. In the third quarter, we received 47 rate applications and we approved 54. There were no lot reclamations received, net appreciations pre-1949 resales. Rules and regulations, we received 7 and approved 3. And we did not receive any society reclamations. And that's it.
Okay. Any questions for Alicia on those activities?
No.
Great. All right. We now move to the vandalism report. I don't know if Louis or Alicia is going to do that.
I can do that.
Great, Alicia, thank you.
Calendar year vandalism collections were $458,307. Assessment collections were $261,456. $261,456, excuse me. Fiscal year collections are vandalism $73,975, assessment $44,624. As far as the 2021 appropriation, we have paid out $141,212.90 on prior year 2019-2020 applications with 2021 funds. We've paid 2021 applications with 2021 funds of $85,042.18. We have an additional $635,166.46 in prior years committed but not paid, and applications approved in 2021 that have not paid are $258,126.45, leaving approximately $880,000 of the 2021 appropriation available for future applications.
Thank you, Alicia. Does anybody have any questions of Alicia's vandalism report? Okay, great. So we have 4 applications for vandalism, abandonment, or repair before us. Again, these are all applications with the understanding that they're being reviewed and, if approved, pending the availability of funds. So again, let's just quick go. I think they're through them. Green Hills Cemetery in Montgomery County. Anybody want to give us a quick overview of that?
Mike, are you on? I'll defer to you on these.
Yes, this is Mike Seelman from the Division of Cemeteries. Green Hills Cemetery in Montgomery County put in a application to repair 73 monuments. The investigator went out and determined that they were appeared to be hazardous and recommended approval in the amount of $28,360.68. The only interesting thing about this was the estimates allowed for capping some of the monuments. So it was actually, the average price was $387, which is less than some claims where they replaced all the foundations. And we recommend approval of that.
Thank you. Tony, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I believe this is an application where they only got one estimate, one bid. Is that correct?
No, they had two. This is Howarth and Batone. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm looking at the Vail. Sorry about that.
We're talking about Green Hill Cemetery, right?
Yeah,
So Mike, am I correct? There was only one bid here?
Would you like me to comment on that? This is Len Breen.
sure.
Yeah, they only got the one estimate for that. Peter Betts, who's on the board, he sent a letter to us. He said that they attempted to get more than one estimate, but both memorial dealers, Letter and McPhee, declined because they had in previous applications submitted estimates, and they were not awarded the bid for the work, so they didn't want to put in the time to submit an estimate because it's very time consuming. So based on their past experience, they felt like they weren't going to get the work, so they didn't want to put in the time to place the estimate. And this is not an uncommon occurrence. We're seeing this more and more for especially the rural cemeteries that they're having a hard time getting more than one estimate. So we have submitted, based on this, we have submitted applications in the past with just the one estimate.
Yeah, so Len, thank you for that. I agree with your observation that we're seeing more and more of these where the cemetery, despite its best effort, can only get one bid. The regulation does require for both vandalism and dangerous monument applications, quote, a copy of bid submitted by at least two contractors, end quote. And I've mentioned this before. I think since we are in the process of amending our regulations, this would be one that we should amend to allow, in circumstances where the cemetery can only get one bid despite a good faith effort, to allow for that to be approved by the board. I would suggest that in those cases that the board require division to demonstrate that the price in that one bid is reasonable based on previous applications, approved applications in the same region. But I would ask that the board consider authorizing us to rewrite those regulations to permit approval on one bid.
I will add that the contractor who submitted, he's done the work. Green Hill, as this is like the third or fourth application that they've submitted. They usually come in every year for hazardous monument repair. And it's the same contractor who's done the work in the past, and so his estimate is comparable to previous estimates the work that he's performed there.
All right. So Tony, you still recommend that we can approve this, right?
Yes, I do. I mean, there's a doctrine of impossibility of performance. I think you shouldn't hold it against the cemetery when it's made its best efforts, but I do think it would be appropriate to amend the regulations to
I don't
formalize that.
I have no objection to that. Any questions on this application? I have a motion. I'll make a motion to approve the Green Hill Cemetery application for dangerous monuments in an amount of $28,360.68. Do you have a second?
I'll second.
Tom, all in favor? Aye.
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 All right, here's an old friend coming back to us, Whispering Maples, and it is comprised of two applications because the cemetery is in two towns. The first is the town of Ellenburg with, again, an application for $17,000. Somebody want to present that application to the board? Mike or,
Sorry, I was muted.
yeah, okay. Go ahead,
So what?
go ahead,
So sorry, Whispering Maples.
yes.
We I think everyone knows the history, but I'm just going to reiterate very briefly. These two cemeteries were abandoned to the town in a process. I believe the actual abandonment occurred in June of 2017, but there was also a receivership that was in place until quite recently. And there was a transitional period there. I'm not going to get into legal niceties of all that. Point being, the cemetery board approved an application for them in the amount of approximately $2.149 million. The precise amounts are in my write-up. There were subsequent change orders because there's certain changes that had to be made to the work that was being done. The result of it is all of the work that was supposed to be done in the original order and all of the work called for in the change orders was performed with two exceptions. The Plattsburgh, as part of the town's takeover, the town of Plattsburgh decided to rename the cemetery because Whispering Maples had a troubled history and they wanted to give it a new name, and they put up a sign. The board approved that sign in the original application back in June 26, 2017. The board also, and the application had allocated up to $4,300 for a sign. As it turns out, the sign's only going to cost $3,800. The other piece was both locations, the one in Plattsburgh and the one in Ellenburg, needed a new lift. The cemeteries are primarily mausoleums, and so you need a lift to get crypts up to anything other than the bottom two rows of crypt spaces to get caskets up to anything other than the bottom two rows of crypt spaces. The price of the lift has gone up a little bit. We allocated $32,950, so I guess that's $16,475, something like that. Half of $32,950 for each lift. We actually the board allocated $32,950 for two lifts. The Plattsburgh lift cost $16,450. The Ellenburg lift is now costing $17,353. The upshot of this is that once you take the change order for certain electrical work into account, the cost of the project with these two final submissions is still within the budget that was previously approved. It will exceed the original $2,149,081.61 because the cost of the Ellenburg lift has gone up slightly. Because it's now 2 years later. We're recommending approval of this. I know council had something to say about how the form of that approval, but I want to make a couple of things clear because they're important to our Bureau of Fiscal Management. Leonard Breen visited the site on July 15th. We verified two things, and not just at that visit, in previous visits, both he and Mike Seelman made as well. Number one, Plattsburgh did not until recently put up a sign, and Ellenburg did not until recently purchase a lift. Number two, when we went there on July 15th, 2020, the sign and lift were in place. We also have invoices showing exactly how much was paid for the work. So we've confirmed that that was all done in accordance with what was proposed. The only difference being that while the sign came in a little under budget, the lift is coming in a little over budget. The entire project is still going to come in slightly less than the total approved. So it wasn't electrical work. The additional money that was approved was for snow guards. The electrical work that was part of the change order was approved without additional funds allocated to it. The snow guards had additional funds allocated to it. My bad. They're still going to come in about $6,000 under what the board approved. And the other thing that I've made clear to the the town's representative is that this is it. And this will be the end of this application. And they're not eligible to seek additional funds. subject to that very long-winded explanation, we're recommending that the board approve the sums requested for the board confirm that its previous, I guess, either modify its previous approval to allow this or confirm that its previous approval includes these particular sums. Tony, I don't know if you have anything to add on the legal end.
Yeah, the only concern I expressed to division was that it shouldn't appear that this is a second application because we don't permit second applications for abandonment funds. It's a one-time thing. As Louis explained, the board did approve expenditures for these two items, the lifts and the signs. The numbers have changed. So it isn't a new application, it's a modification of the previous application. I also want to point out, because the number is so large, that the amount awarded to these two towns, a substantial portion of that came through special legislation that provided specific funds for this application. That's how it got to $2 million. Really, the crux of my concern is how the board order is written that will be signed to make sure that it confirms with the fact that this is a modification, not a new application.
Does anybody have any additional questions? I'll take these two together then if I can. On the application from the town of Ellenburg and the town of Plattsburgh. Hearing none, I'll make a motion to approve to modify our previous application to incorporate price changes for the town of Ellenburg of $17,353 and the town of Plattsburgh $3,800 in total. Do I have a second?
Just to clarify, well, I'll get your second first, then I'll clarify.
Second.
I think you said modify the application. The application is not being modified. The application
Modify
is
our approval.
it's the approval is being modified.
Thank you.
Okay.
Any other questions or suggestions? Hearing none, all in favor? Aye. Aye. Can't hear anybody. Motion carries. Next on our list is Vail Cemetery. So I want to present that application.
Len or Mike, one of you.
I've got it. The Vail Cemetery vandalized, 38 monuments in total were vandalized. Now, on the police report, as I mentioned in my report, the police report only indicates 30 monuments were vandalized. And I asked Dr. McAvoy about that, and he said that the other additional 8 monuments were vandalized after the police made their report. This would not be uncommon for Vail. Vail has, over the years, has experienced recurring acts of vandalism. In fact, about every year we get an application from Vail for vandalism. It's a highly trafficked cemetery. Walk through there, using it as a, they cut across the cemetery to go to other parts of the city, and then they experience vandalism yearly. So it's 38 monuments total. I verified that all 38 were down, toppled on the ground, and they ran the legal ad. And everything appears to be in order for the application, and I recommend that it be approved.
Thank you, Len. Any questions for Leonard? There being none, I'll make a motion to approve the application of Vail Cemetery for vandalism funds out of $8,877.16. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Great. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. I think that completes our applications. Again, reminder that these are all approved contingent on the availability of funds. That was a total of $58,390.80. We can move on to other applications. We have an application from Vestal Park Cemetery for additional columbarium. One of the division members present.
Brendan, are you on? Do you want to do this?
Sure. Vestal Park Cemetery is in the town of Vestal, Broome County. They've experienced, as the whole state has, an uptick in the number of cremation interments compared to full body interments. So they've decided to apply to the cemetery board to install a columbarium unit. There are not many of these in the southern tier as a whole. Curiously, they tend to find themselves in Catholic cemeteries. In Broome County, there's one in a regulated cemetery and another in a Catholic cemetery. But it's a product that has found popularity elsewhere in the state, and I see no reason why it wouldn't, become popular in this area as well. Vestal Park is a very well-funded cemetery, and for that reason, we recommend approval of this application. It looks like it will definitely be a benefit to the cemetery. It will make good use of their remaining land. They have some land left for full body burials, but they're situated in a neighborhood, so it's not like there's unlimited land available. It's a good opportunity for them, and for that reason, we recommend approval.
Thank you, Brendan. Any questions or discussion by board members?
Yeah, just a quick question. This is their first columbarium that they're putting in? No other one there?
Correct.
Tony, do you have anything to add on the application?
Yeah, just one general concern that I asked division to take a look at. I noticed that 2019 was the cemetery's worst year for lot sales and burials. I was wondering if division could take a look at 2020 to see if things have gotten better in that regard. Louis, do you have anything on that?
Andrew, are you on?
Yes, this is Andrew Hickey, the accountant for division accountant. I agree with everything Brendan said. It's a good point that Tony makes. We did get information from them for the, it's not a full calendar year in 20, but their 2020 sales, lot sales, Tony, as well as burials are above the last 4-year average. So 19, I think, was a low year. 17 was a very high year in both lot sales and burials. But 2020 has shown, I won't say a large increase, but numbers have gone more closely to years prior to 2019. So it appears 19 was, just happened to be a low year.
The only other concern, well, it's not even a concern. The only point I want to make is the comment period. Based on the signs that the cemetery has posted, people have until October 16 to comment. So if the board approves this, it should be conditioned on no negative comments being received after the approval.
Okay, any other questions? I'll make a motion to approve the application of Vestal Park Cemetery for their columbarium with the caveat that they do not receive any negative comments prior to the end of the comment period. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. I don't know if there's anybody else wishing to speak, applicant or anything on this this application. Okay, just want to make sure the applicant had a chance to speak if they wanted to. So all in favor of the Vestal Park Cemetery application? Aye.
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 Thank you. Motion carries. Next on our list is the application of Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery. It's a major renovation, a new retort. Can we get a presentation by the board, by the division?
I'll give a very brief overview, then I'll defer to investigator Leonard Breen if he's got anything to add. Very briefly, Poughkeepsie Rural, one of their retorts is pre-1989 and cannot be brought into compliance with the current, with the change in DEC rules that'll take effect in about 4.5 years. And so they want to replace it now. They were one of the cemeteries that handled large additional volume from downstate during the height of the pandemic, and want to be better prepared with a newer machine and not wait to the last minute to go ahead and do that. In fact, they began the process of getting this approval back in 2018. They'd been waiting, even before the DEC regulations came out, they'd been waiting for approval from DEC. They have that now, so they want to go ahead. We don't think there's any reason to say that Poughkeepsie should have less cremation capacity, which is essentially what's going to happen if they don't reduce this retort. And so we recommend approval.
Any questions from the members?
No.
None here.
No.
Is there anyone else that wishes to speak to this application?
Eric, I'll just note that I don't have any comments or concerns.
I'm sorry, Tony. Thank you. Yeah, sure. Thank you. All right, so I'll make a motion to approve the application from Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery for a major renovation for a new retort. Do I have a second? Did I already do this?
I'll second.
Thank you, Tom. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. Thank you. We now have, it's not quite an application for determination from Better Place Forests. This will require a longer discussion. We'll probably move to executive session before we take action, but the division and council, I think, both have a presentation. So, Louis?
Sure. I'm going to actually rely very heavily on what we put in writing. I don't want to waste our or the applicant's time reiterating that. The applicant, I'm sure, is going to have something to say about it, and I want to give them the opportunity to do that. I want to clarify a couple of things on this that based on we received some comments from two ministers today in support of the project, and they seem to me to reflect a misunderstanding of what is and isn't before the board. So I wanted to make that clear. Well, let me take a step back. In brief, Better Place Forests is a for-profit Delaware corporation with seems a principal place of business in California. They operate. Their business model appears to be they sell the right to, they sell a memorial tree and a place to dispose of cremated remains. And
Perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Louis is frozen up.
assert
Louis, you froze for a minute.
Can you still hear me?
I can now.
I'm going to stop my video. Maybe that'll help.
Okay.
All right. Is that you can still hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So I'm going to repeat what I don't know how much of that I froze through, so I'm going to repeat. They market themselves as an alternative to cemeteries. In fact, in a filing with the California Secretary of State, they've described their business as the development, operation, and marketing of cemeteries. And they nevertheless, they seek a determination they seek something from the board indicating that if they were to do what in New York, what they do elsewhere, in other words, sell a memorial tree and a specific place for final disposition of cremated remains, that would not make them a cemetery. We believe as a matter of policy that if they want to do what they need to do, they would in fact be a cemetery for purposes of New York law and public policy. And that because that would make them a cemetery, they can't do that because it's very clear here that cemeteries have to be either not-for-profit corporations, governmental entities, or religious corporations, which are also, by the way, not-for-profit. Some of the confusion in the letters of support, I don't know whether it's confusion or what, some of the letters of support seem to indicate that the division opposes having memorial forests with the right to deposit cremated remains. That's not our position at all. If a not-for-profit cemetery corporation wanted to do this, we would look at such an application. That's not what this is. The issue here is that this is a for-profit corporation doing what we believe to be things that can only be done by cemetery corporations or municipal cemeteries or national cemeteries in New York.
Thank you, Louis. I'll just make a point that we did receive quite a few documents yesterday and this morning, and glad to have them, but it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody has had a chance to review them.
Sorry, Mark, one more thing, just for record keeping. One of the documents that we received yesterday was something that we had seen before, was a letter from council to Better Place Forests. I had included a previous version of that letter in what I sent to the board. That letter should also have been part of what was presented to the board for decision, and that's my omission. It doesn't change anything in our thinking, but it really ought to be considered part of the record.
Okay, well, they're all part of the record. Just the question is, how much time did you have? So, okay. So, council, do you have something to add?
Yeah. Well, just procedurally, I think it's important to know what is actually in front of the board. This is kind of an unusual presentation because Better Place Forests isn't actually seeking to be organized as a cemetery corporation, and it isn't seeking approval from the board to be organized and operate as a cemetery corporation. It's seeking the negative of that, a determination that if it operated in New York, that it would not have to be organized as a cemetery corporation. It's always been the position of the board that it doesn't provide advisory opinions, and that it only makes determinations on actual applications. But it's the position of council that A Better Place Forest has gone as far as it can, short of actually buying land and beginning operation, to present this matter for determination. This is kind of similar to when we discovered that a pet cemetery was accepting human cremated remains, and the board authorized division to issue cease and desist letters. If Better Place Forest actually engaged in operation here as a for-profit entity, the board would then have to determine, is this operating as a cemetery? Should we direct cease and desist as we did with the pet cemetery? That would be terribly unfair to Better Place Forest to require it to buy land and engage in operations before it could come before the board. So I do believe that the posture of the presentation is appropriate. And the question before the board is to provide a determination that if A Better Place Forest operated in New York, whether it would have to be organized as a cemetery corporation pursuant to Article 50 of the NPCL. That's the issue that's being presented if the board is willing to entertain that request for determination. On the issue of what the board should determine, council agrees with division that all the material that's been presented indicates that the activity A Better Place Forest seeks to engage in would make it a cemetery subject to Article 15, especially when one looks at how the term cemetery purposes has been interpreted by the courts. And when one looks at the activities that Better Place Forest seeks to engage in, what its contract looks like, how it advertises itself. And, one of the distinctions for the board to look at is, the Better Place Forest has indicated it believes that it would be engaged in scattering activity, which is permitted on private property. But a good counterpoint to what Better Place Forest seeks to do, it was what the City of New York permits in its parks. And I've provided the board a memo that compares and contrasts the two activities, and whether what Better Place Forest truly would be engaging in is scattering, as is permitted in the New York City parks. So there's a lot more in the memo, but as Mark indicated, it's probably appropriate to go into executive session to have a full open discussion with the board on that.
Thank you, Tony. I know we have at least one representative of the applicant, quote applicant, available. I'm not sure if we have more than one. So is there someone from the representing Better Place Forest who would like to speak to the board?
Good morning. Yes, it's Sandy Gibson. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Better Place Forest. Can everyone hear and see me right now?
You can see you.
Can you?
I can hear you. There you go.
Hear me? Excellent. Okay, thank you. So thank you so much for taking the time to learn about Better Place Forests. As you know, in early 2019, we reached out to the Division of Cemeteries to request clarity on what activities we can perform in the state of New York without being treated as a cemetery corporation. That's why we're here today, to seek your guidance on what Better Place Forests operations, if any, may be limited under New York law. We are not a cemetery, and we did not provide an application to be considered a cemetery, as we've just discussed. But my colleagues can speak to that in greater detail in a moment. I just wanted to make sure I could introduce Better Place Forests to you all, why we founded the company, what our mission is, and what we aim to accomplish in the state of New York. Then I'll turn it over to my VP of Legal and Regulatory, as well as our outside counsel and advisor, Professor Tanya Marsh, who's one of the nation's foremost experts on U.S. cemetery law. Better Place Forests, we launched America's first conservation memorial forests in California as a way to help each person leave a legacy of conservation. Each customer contributes to the purchase, endowment, and permanent preservation of a forest. We partner with local land trusts to provide conservation easements to ensure the land will never be developed, and sometimes to spread ashes on their properties themselves. Additionally, we create a stewardship endowment to ensure that the funds will always be accessible to pay for the ongoing care and preservation of the forest. It's very difficult to raise funds for care and maintenance of conservation areas. I'm a counselor at Save the Redwoods League, one of the oldest conservation groups in the country in California. And I see firsthand how important it is to engage donors and the public in long-term stewardship. For example, the New York Times just published a sad and scary article about the health of New England's forests. New England's forests are sick, they need more tree doctors. This is true everywhere in the country, but we need a way to pay for them. And the current conservation models are struggling to raise those funds. Better Place Forests is a new model that provides the emotional connection and the funds to pay for the stewardship. That's why Kathy Moser, Chief Conservation Officer of the Open Space Institute, and Michelle Smith, Executive Director of the Hudson Highlands Land Trust, have written to the New York State Division of Cemeteries to tell the division how important our model is to the future of conservation in New York State. It's also an affordable way that we can democratize conservation in a tangible and meaningful way, so that any family who chooses Better Place Forest can be proud of the fact that they left a legacy that makes the world a little bit more beautiful than they found it. In addition to our conservation work, we seek to be an active part of any community we're a part of. This spring in California, Arizona, we launched our COVID Memorial Heroes program, offering any frontline workers who lose their lives during this pandemic a free memorial tree in one of our forests. We heard loud and clear from legislators like Assemblywoman Tremaine Wright, chair of the New York State Black, Puerto Rican, Hispanic, and Asian Legislative Caucus, that New Yorkers want us to bring the COVID Memorials Heroes program to New York. We're keen to do so and to make sure that any family who has lost their hero can have a beautiful family tree. Jamila Edwards of DC 37, the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, part of the AFL-CIO, representing more than 150,000 active members and 50,000 retirees, told us the same thing. Many New Yorkers want a beautiful and natural, affordable option like Better Place Forest. And this is important not just to the families who need a program like Memorial Trees for Heroes, but also for any family that can choose cremation and want a more natural or affordable option for their family. And that's why I found a Better Place Forests. My father died of a stroke when I was 10 years old, and a year later, my mother died of cancer. My mother wanted my brother and I to have a place we could go back and visit her and my father, because she knew that sometimes you just need to be near someone. But in the city where I'm from, a family plot cost nearly $75,000 in the mid-1990s. And even that, the only one we could find that we could afford was about 15 feet from the street. Years later, the city put a bus stop right by it. So instead of a beautiful place, when I think of my parents, I think of that black tombstone. And I hear the sound of that bus stop. And for me, the place where I know my parents wanted to be was somewhere beautiful in nature. But before my mother died, she created a nonprofit cancer support center where cancer survivors counsel and support cancer patients. Went on to 13 centers across Canada and support more than 100,000 families. So when I think of Mom, I see that image of that black tombstone, but I also think of the legacy that she left in the world. The mission of Better Place Forests is to help every person who wants to leave a legacy for their family and for the environment. And we do it affordably so every person can have that choice. My hope is that we can do that in New York. With that, I'd like to introduce Nandi Chabra from Better Place Forests to speak about some of the legal issues that were brought up by Director Polishuk.
Thank you, Sandy, and good morning, everyone. Can you hear and see me all right?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. As Sandy mentioned, we're here to seek clarification on what operations, if any, by our company may be limited under New York law. And to that end, Better Place Forests contacted the Division of Cemeteries in early 2019 to introduce our company and seek guidance and confirm that no proposed activities of the company would be prohibited, much less render it a cemetery under New York law. This is a process that we've followed before we commence operations in any new state, not because we believe that we're proposing to conduct cemetery operations, but because we recognize that our operations are unique and we did not want confusion about the applicability of any existing regulations. And we do appreciate the division is taking the time to respond to our inquiry with its analysis. I'll note, as has been noted previously, that a number of materials we provided since 2019, including a legal memo, have now been provided once more over email, and we sincerely hope the board has the opportunity to review those materials. And we hope to have the opportunity to review any legal memoranda that the division may be putting together, which may be new. The division's analysis provided so far does not respond to our request for clarification, and in our view provides no examples of Better Place Forest activities which would render it a cemetery. Its only assertion is that we would allow for our customers to dispose of or bury human remains on our properties by cremation or in a grave, mausoleum, vault, columbarium, or other receptacle. That assertion is inaccurate, and Professor Tanya Marsh will speak to that fact and to cemetery law in New York in a moment. The division highlights May 2019 Statement of Information filing with the California Secretary of State, which provides that BPF engages in cemetery operations. That statement was a clerical error made by an accounting contractor with whom the company no longer has a relationship and hasn't for a very long time. We've corrected the filing so that it provides that the company operates conservation and memorial forests. And in fact, the company operates across 3 states with multiple subsidiaries, and cemetery operations are referenced in none of those filings. The 2019 California filing was an error. But more importantly, an administrative filing in another state does not determine whether a company's operations comply with New York laws. If such a statement were determinative, then this wouldn't be an issue anymore because the current filing provides that we're not a cemetery. Instead, it's the substance, it's Better Place Forest actual operations, which we deem relevant. And on the substance of our operations, the California Cemetery and Funeral Board actually took a look at this issue and found that we are not operating as a cemetery. And further, no state where BPF, Better Place Forest, is operating has, or where we've sought to operate, has concluded that the company is a cemetery. So the New York Division of Cemeteries would be the first and only state to conclude that operations like ours could constitute a cemetery. Now I'll turn it over to Professor Tanya Marsh to speak about cemetery law and how it applies to the facts of our company. Professor Marsh is the nation's leading scholar on cemetery and funeral law. She's a professor of law at Wake Forest School of Law and is the author of scores of articles, more than 5 books on cemetery and funeral law, including Cemetery Law, The Common Law of Burying Grounds in the United States, and Law of Human Remains. She's a regular speaker to the cemetery and funeral industry, and importantly, that has included a 2018 presentation to the New York State Association of Cemeteries at its annual meeting on the topic of the 1949 New York Cemetery Act. Better Place Forest engaged Tanya as an advisor because she has such a depth of experience in this body of law and in specific states across the country.
Mr. Chopper, before we go to Professor March, I have one. This is Louis Polishuk again. I have one quick question. You stated that the California board had determined that you are in fact not a cemetery. You have not submitted a document to us to that effect? If you have one, we would ask you to please submit it.
Absolutely. We'll provide the results of an investigation of the California Cemetery and Funeral Bureau to that effect.
Thank you.
Great. Okay. Well, this is Tanya Marsh. Thank you, Nandi. We appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today. Everybody can hear me, I hope.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. So Nandi mentioned a moment ago, and Mr. Polishuk mentioned a few minutes ago, that we provided a letter on January 2nd, 2020, that lays out our analysis of why a conservation memorial forest is not a cemetery under New York law. And I appreciate that you haven't had that letter to review until recently. So I just want to give you a brief summary of our major points that we made in that letter. First, as you well know, this board is created by Article 15 of the Not-for-Profit Corporation Law. That article, which establishes the board, also grants it authority to regulate certain activity, which is the creation and operation of cemeteries in the state. And that article also defines the limits of that regulatory authority. Article 15 does not offer a precise definition of a cemetery, and that's not unusual. Many states don't precisely define a cemetery, and perhaps that's because for most of human or American history, we knew exactly what a cemetery was. It was real property perpetually dedicated to the disposition of intact human remains, either by burial in a grave or entombment in a mausoleum or a vault. And that definition is certainly consistent with the language of Article 15, including the definition of a cemetery corporation as an entity that engages in the disposal or burial of deceased human beings by cremation or in a grave, mausoleum, vault, columbarium, or other receptacle. Better Place Forest simply does not meet this definition. It will not be engaged in the burial of deceased human beings. It will indeed permit no burials whatsoever. It will also not be engaged in the disposal of deceased human beings. It's interesting, this phrase deceased human beings isn't defined by New York law either, which again isn't particularly unusual. But in Article 15, Section 1517, the statute that describes crematory operations, the text describes how deceased human beings must be handled right up until the cremation process is completed. And then the statute no longer mentions deceased human beings, it only mentions cremains. Cremains are defined by Article 15, and they do not include intact human remains. Better Place Forest is simply going to allow customers to spread cremains, which are definitionally not deceased human beings, in our conservation memorial forest. So again, a cemetery corporation is an entity that engages in the disposal or burial of deceased human beings by cremation or in a grave, mausoleum, vault, columbarium, or other receptacle. No deceased human beings will be disposed of or buried in a conservation memorial forest. Better Place Forest will not own or operate a crematory. No cremains will be placed in a grave, mausoleum, vault, columbarium, or any other receptacle. Instead, customers will be permitted to spread them around a designated tree consistent with Article 15, Section 1517I, which allows cremated remains to be disposed of in any manner whatever on the private property of a consenting owner. I'd also like to emphasize that in Section 1517, the legislature explicitly contemplated that cremains could be scattered on private property. That isn't a cemetery, and it chose not to regulate that activity. That choice, by the way, is highly typical. I can't think of a single state that regulates private property or the owners of private property where cremains are scattered. And that is in part, I think, because the legislature viewed cremation itself as final disposition and then chose not to regulate what happened with the cremains thereafter. Two quick final points, I think, underscore how inapplicable the New York Cemetery Act is to better place forests. First, I understand well the reasons that the legislature created the Cemetery Act and why Section 1501, the Declaration of Policy, grounds the exercise of police powers throughout Article 15 in a desire to prevent cemeteries from falling into disrepair and dilapidation and becoming a burden upon the community. This is obviously a legitimate public policy goal, but it's one that's tied to a traditional cemetery in which bodies are interred or entombed. A cemetery that's landscaped, it's actively maintained by mowing, attention to fences, monuments, and driveways. None of these physical features will be present in a conservation memorial forest, nor do the terms disrepair and dilapidation apply to a conservation area. Finally, Section 1501 describes the fundamental organizational structure of cemeteries in New York State as nonprofits for the mutual benefit of lot owners. Conservation memorial forests will not be subdivided. There will be no lot owners or any persons with a similar legal standing to a lot owner. This is a cornerstone concept of the New York Cemetery Act and wholly inapplicable to a conservation memorial forest. Our letter goes into more detail about our legal basis for our conclusion that Better Place Forest is not a cemetery corporation and that a conservation memorial forest is not a cemetery. To date, we haven't received any substantive response to those legal arguments. Instead, as I read the division's memo to you dated September 30th, the suggestion is that Better Place Forest is subject to Article 15 because we offer a product that is different from and potentially in competition with a cemetery. And the public policy argument here seems to be that entities that offer alternatives to cemeteries are subject to cemetery regulation. And I understand and appreciate where that argument is coming from. I understand the division's interest and the board's interest in protecting New York's nonprofit cemeteries. New York cemeteries are precious and they are deserving of protection. But again, I'd refer back to the enabling legislation. The division and the board simply cannot exceed the regulatory authority granted by the legislature. Article 15 regulates cemeteries. The board and the division are tasked with enforcing Article 15. We are not a cemetery corporation. The way that term is defined by New York law, we will not establish a cemetery. Therefore, we ask the board to agree, as we requested in our letter, that we're not subject to regulation by the division. And alternatively, we seek guidance on what specific operations of Better Place Forests, if any, may be limited by New York law. All that being said, we remain very interested in dialogue and are open to a voluntary agreement where Better Place Forests commits to business practices that are consistent with the spirit of the Declaration of Policy in Article 15, including our intent to establish an endowment care fund, to permanently preserve any land we purchase, to provide consumer disclosures, and provide disclosures to the cemetery division on an ongoing basis if desired. So we are happy to answer any questions you have, and we appreciate you considering our unusual request today.
Mark, hi, this is Yvette Buckner, the lobbyist for Better Place Forests. I'd just like to just point out that the folks from Better Place have presented, and as the letters that I've sent over indicate, that we have a lot of support, not only from land trusts, but also from community groups, faith organizations, and unions. And so I'd like to also have the Reverend Kirsten John Foy speak on behalf of this, because this has affected many communities here in New York City, especially Black and Brown members. And so I would just like to turn it over to Kirsten to say a few words before we conclude.
Yvette, can you just identify your firm, so for the record?
Yes, Yvette Buckner, Tusk Strategies, TUSK.
Good morning. As has been stated by Ms. Buckner, my name is Reverend Kirsten John Foy, and I am the president and CEO of the Arc of Justice. And we are a national civil rights organization. I just wanted to take exception to what has been characterized as a misunderstanding. I hope that Mr. Polishuk was not attempting in his commentary to impugn our cognitive capacities. Notwithstanding that, I appreciate the opportunity to speak before you this morning. As has been stated, I am Kirsten John Foy. I'm a minister, civil and human rights activist, and the president of the Arc of Justice. I'm deeply troubled by the Division of Cemeteries' recommendation to the Board of Directors to reject the application for Better Place Forest. In doing so, they also reject the calls from our community to permit more options for both the deceased and their families to make end-of-life decisions a bit more tranquil. This is particularly damaging for Black New Yorkers during the COVID pandemic, which has severely disproportionately impacted our community. While many white residents were able to quarantine in more palatial surroundings, either in larger apartments in the city or in second homes elsewhere, Black and brown residents had to keep working and often did not have the luxury of working from home, as we were deemed essential workers. Also, with much of our recent lives engulfed in chaos, one would think the New York State would permit us to find eternal peace as we choose. Unfortunately, the state's Division of Cemeteries will not even permit that. We are in an existential moment in New York, American, and human history. This requires a transformation and a re-envisioning of every aspect of our lives. This mandate and imperative extends to the transition of life policy and industry. I would suggest this board, in opposing the application of Better Place Forest or failing to approve, is not only abdicating that mandate and imperative, it is doing so to the detriment of our moral, social, and collective psyche. The spectrum of faith, and as the spectrum of faith enlarges and broadens, the state has an obligation to mature its understanding of this expansion, as well as its role in honoring the First Amendment prohibition on the free exercise of religion. The state has no place in artificially undergirding and protecting outmoded industries, particularly when those industries may encroach on our ability to freely exercise our religious rites and rituals. Clearly, Better Place Forest provides an environmental benefit. Conservation and responsible conservation is the only means by which we can move forward in a sustainable manner as a civil society. There's a moral imperative, and I would argue that this body's mission, establishes stewardship over religious exercise and by extension, moral and spiritual well-being. As a result, this body is obligated to continue to review, mature, and advance its understanding of free exercise of religion, particularly as it relates to end of life. There is also clearly an economic imperative. Funeral costs provide and present undue burdens on working families, communities of color, and essential workers. What Better Place Forest does is provide a religiously acceptable and excellent option that is cost effective for those who have borne out the greatest cost of being New Yorkers, essential workers, working families, and people of color who have kept New York running during this pandemic and crisis. I appreciate the opportunity to speak before you, and I would welcome any questions you may have of me. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll just, if I could, I'm sorry to jump in. I think Ms. Michelle Smith from the Hudson Highlands Land Trust may wish to speak as well.
Yes, I would. Can you hear me? I think that my video, I am on video, but I'm also identified as call-in user 7. So I think I've disconnected my video and my audio. But I am, if you page through and you would like to see me while I'm talking, my video screen is on under the name Michelle Smith. Thank you for the opportunity to make some comments. Thank you for the Reverend who just spoke about the importance of conservation and stewardship in this business model. My name is Michelle Smith. I'm the Executive Director of the Hudson Highlands Land Trust. We are a land trust that's been in operation for 30 years, since 1989, protecting and preserving the natural resources of the Hudson Highlands area, which, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, it's about 50 miles north of New York City along the Hudson River, and it is a spectacularly beautiful area. One of the things that we're always focused on that's become a greater concern during the pandemic is funding for conservation. And we were delighted at the beginning of the year, actually during the pandemic, at the start of the pandemic, when Better Place Forest approached us about potential projects in the New York area. And we realized that as we're dealing as a state with a budget crisis coming out of the pandemic, and potentially decreased government funding, both state and municipal funding for conservation, we were delighted that Better Place Forest was coming into New York with a business model that provided funding for conservation, very much needed funding for conservation at a time where other sources, were threatened, and also where development pressure, we're seeing tremendous development pressure in New York State from people moving out of New York City. And so we were actually thrilled to see such a business model entering the state. And, I understand that, you have to do all your due diligence on this business model, but I would hope, given that New York State is very, sees conservation as a high priority, conservation of our natural forests as a high priority, that the state would find a way to accommodate this business model, because it really provides much needed funding for conservation here. And again, thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you. I'm not sure who's in charge, but are there others from Better Place Forest wishing to speak?
Mark, if nobody else from the public wishes to speak, Louis Polishuk here. I had one question for Professor Marsh, and I just wanted to reiterate one thing in public session. But I think Dave Fleming might have wanted to be heard.
Yeah, I'm not closing it off. I'm asking if there's anybody left from Better Place Forest who would like to.
Okay, fair.
You have a question, Louis, of them?
I had a question to Professor Marsh, which is, if I heard you correctly, which I think I probably didn't, you state that the disposal, the scattering, final disposition of cremated remains is not regulated in any state. It's my understanding that Better Place Forest is in fact licensed in at least one California county as a quote unquote cremated remains disposer, which is a category created in California law that we don't have. I was wondering if I was wrong about that.
Right. Sorry. Just to clarify, what I said was that I can't think of any other state that regulates the private property or the owners of the private property where cremated remains are spread. You're correct that California has that licensure and that Better Place Forest is licensed to scatter cremated remains. That means that they can contract directly to families to actually physically handle the remains and to take care of the disposal. That's an additional option that they wanted to allow in California, but that's not related to the fact that they own the real property upon which the cremains will be scattered. I hope that makes sense.
I would like to clarify one additional point there as well. That licensure is not required when the family is present to do the spreading ceremony themselves. That is only required if a family member is not present and someone wishes to, for a fee, do a spreading ceremony on private property for the family. So Better Place Forests as an entity is not licensed. Simply, we have some employees who separately are licensed individually so that they can do spreading ceremonies for families without the presence of a family there.
Are there any other questions of the people presenting on behalf of Better Place Forests? Somebody's typing. If you're typing, you're on mute. Please mute your phone. Okay. Are there any other members of the public wishing to address this matter?
David Fleming from the New York State Association of Cemeteries. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a point of clarification, the proposal before the board, while the association does not oppose the proposal as a cemetery operation, we do take exception with the fact that what is being proposed, in fact, is currently a regulated activity by the New York State Cemetery Board. Our members currently are natural cemeteries regulated by the board. The board has approved projects where the same process is being done. I think the question really before the board is whether or not it's a nonprofit entity that's a regulated cemetery, or if it's a for-profit entity. I haven't heard anything nor read anything in the application materials before the board where the board opposes or the state opposes the proposal as far as allowing families additional options to memorialize their loved ones. I think that's something that's being done every day across New York. There are more projects currently under development for natural cemeteries for different options for families. But I think it's extremely important for the board to note that, as I've said before at previous meetings, that the activities proposed by this application are currently regulated by the state of New York, and they have been regulated and approved in several instances by the State Cemetery Board. Approval of this application, not as for a for-profit entity conducting the same services that a nonprofit entity has been regulated under, essentially deregulates the entire portion of the cemetery industry. And I think that's an extremely important point for this board to understand. We are regulated, have had to go before the board, have had to have our projects approved directly relating to scattering, not anything else, but scattering gardens, memorial gardens, natural cemeteries without markers, without designations. Those have all been before the board and have been for several years. While I appreciate the legal discussion of what the statute says and what it has not said and what the legislature has done and not done, for the 25 years that I've been doing cemetery regulation discussions and meetings and negotiations on legislation in New York, what has been clear is that the legislature has granted broad police powers to the cemetery board to regulate all aspects of disposal of human remains, cremains included. And many of us don't like that particular word, but that's the case. And it is under the board's purview, as it has been documented over and over again by the approvals submitted and directed by this board. So that is our position. It is not about whether or not the project is good or bad. It is, as we understand it, the discussion before the board is whether or not there should be a nonprofit entity that is regulated by the State Cemetery Board. And our position is that all such activities should be regulated by the state of New York, and they should be under the purview of the New York State Cemetery Board. Thank you.
David, do board members have any questions for, first of all, is there any other members of the public wishing to speak to this matter? Okay. Does the board have any questions for Mr. Fleming? Okay, so I think what's going to happen is we're going to move to executive session. But before we do that, I would like to do some other housekeeping. First, are there any members of the public that wish to speak or speak to the board on any other matter regarding cemetery board regulations or operations?
Sorry, Mark, I had one more comment on Better Place.
Thank you,
You
Louis.
had asked me to hold off on until we heard from the rest of the public. So now that we've done that, I'd like to just reiterate something which I think I referred to misunderstanding. I think my write-up was not sufficiently clear on this point, and I'm sorry that I wasn't more explicit. Our view is not, we're expressing no opinion on this particular method of final disposition. In fact, Whitehaven Memorial Park in Rochester does something very, very similar to what Better Place is proposing right now with its cemetery. Having said that, the issue we see the issue of is two things. Number one is our understanding, and Better Place can correct us if we're wrong, is that the entity that will be doing this work will not be a cemetery corporation, but rather will be an out-of-state for-profit corporation. So that's issue number one for us, is that it's a for-profit corporation. Issue number two is that it seems that taking Better Place's statements to their conclusion, their assertion is that the activity they propose to engage in is entirely unregulated. And we don't really have we have absolutely no objection to to this particular the model per se. We do have an issue with it being something that is essentially a cemetery being completely unregulated, and that's our concern. It's not the model per se. If it were, we don't have enough here. If this were presented as not-for-profit corporation, there isn't really enough here to approve it, but there's no principled reason we'd object to it if we had all the information we needed about that not-for-profit.
Okay, so again, is there anyone from the public wishing to address the board on any other matter that's either before us or subject to board action? Okay. Second, let's just set the next meeting date. Louis, it will be November what?
Sorry, I muted myself again. It's the best way to shut me up. November 10th.
Okay.
10:30 a.m.
Next board meeting will be November 10th.
My assumption, so the executive order expires either on November 3rd or November 4th. Assuming it gets extended, we anticipate that the meeting will be entirely virtual again.
Okay, well, we'll wait and see what happens. Again, just before we go make a motion to go to executive session, I'm just going to, make the point that we will come back out of executive session into public session. You can stay on the line. We go to a different room to have that conversation. No action will be taken in executive session. If there is action to be taken, we will come out and take that action in public session. So, is there anything else I need to address before we go to executive session?
Mr. Patterson?
Yeah, who's speaking?
I'm sorry, this is Nandi Chabra from Better Place Forests.
Yes. No.
If I could just ask for the purposes of our issue, could you advise on how it may be, is a decision expected to be made in executive session? We're happy to stay on the line if you think it might be considered again in the public session and answer questions.
Why don't you guys give us, just text me in the chat as to which, send me privately somebody's contact. Actually, I have Ms. Buckner's email. I can email her the second we come out of executive session, and you can jump right back on. That way you don't have to sit there staring at the screen while you see nothing.
I don't know if that's the reason for your question, and I can't tell you what the board will do. We will not make a decision in executive session, but it's possible that we would come out of executive session and re-engage in this discussion and make a public discussion. I just don't know for sure what the result of our conversation will be. Again, certain documents were presented fairly recently, and there may be more for us to find out about. So does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you so much, and we'll remain available.
Okay. And we'll, again, if you want us to, we'll remind you when we come out. So I'm going to make a motion that we go into executive session for the purposes, Tony, help me, of potential litigation or whatever are the other things that we might be discussing, Tony?
Yeah, confidential communications with counsel as well.
Right. So these are not public discussions.
And we actually have one investigative matter as well, not related to what we've talked about.
Thank you, Louis. I appreciate that. So I'll make that motion. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Tom.
I'm dropping out now. I'm going to open the executive session Webex.
Okay. We'll just for members or other interested parties who would be in the executive session, we'll give you 2 minutes or so, 2-3 minutes for the necessities if you want before we open up or we start a conversation in the executive session. So that's mostly for the board members and council and the director. Okay, so all in favor of the move to executive session? Aye?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. We'll be back. Thank you. Okay, so we are back in public session. We met in executive discussion, discussed several issues. No action was taken. At this point, in regard to the discussion we had around Better Place Forests, we are not in a position to make any particular determinations at this point. We do want to say, and sense the board, that we are appreciative of your patience. You presented us with a unique and unusual request, and that has taken some time. So we appreciate your patience. We also very much appreciate the passion you bring to the discussion, those who support it. We, in fact, have several cemeteries that are offering similar services as Better Place for Us now. And so the sense of the board is that if we were to review this as a Better Place for Us, it was constituted as a not-for-profit cemetery under 15A that subject to review of the particular application, we would look at that fairly favorably. That is the sense of the board at this point. So I don't know if any other board members would like to comment at this point. Okay, so no other comments. That would conclude our discussion of the concept of Better Place for Us at this time. Anybody else have anything else to bring to the board? If not, I'll take a motion to adjourn. I'll make a motion to adjourn. I have a second.
I'll second.
Okay, all in favor? Thank you all for your time and patience. All in favor? Aye. Thank you all.